Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second seminar of the Philosophy and Psychiatry on Philosophy and Psychiatry for this year. And it will be my pleasure and honor to invite and present our second guest for this year, and this is Dr. Angelos Sofocleous. He will be talking about very interesting, at least for me, and I hope for every one of you, very interesting topic on experience of depression and disruptions of interpersonal relationships. So I will just do a short introduction and present our lecturer for today. Angelos has recently obtained his PhD in philosophy from the University of York with a PhD thesis titled A Phenomenological Study of Interpersonal Interrelationships in the Experiences of Depression. So his research has focused on understanding certain disruptions that take place in a depressed individual interpersonal relationships. He also holds a BA in philosophy and psychology and an MA in philosophy from the University of Durham. He is currently a tutor in philosophy at the Center for Lifelong Learning of the University of York. And today he will be talking about disruptions in interpersonal relationships in depression. So he will talk for about 45 minutes or an hour or so, and after that we will have discussion. So Angelos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Janko. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor, I must say, to present at this seminar series. So as Janko said, I have just recently obtained my PhD in philosophy at the University of York. My research was on depression, but more specifically on interpersonal relationships in depression, how they are affected, and how we can understand the disruptions in interpersonal relationships that take place in depression. Today, I will talk about a specific aspect of my research, which concerns the experience of depression as unhomelike. So this is experiencing the world in a very different way than one used to experience in the past and in respect to different people. Let me now share my presentation and we'll get to some of the specific ideas that I will be looking at, that we will be looking at today. Now, I will be looking at three, I'm not going to say claims, perhaps observations. Sorry about the wrong numbering there. Three observations that I have come to acquire through my research. So the first observation is that through analyzing and examining first-person reports, that is memoirs, autobiographies, interviews with depressed people, it's very common to see that depression is experienced as such a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world that it is experienced as unhomelike. Now, a question that might emerge at this point is distinct in respect to what? Distinct in two ways. Distinct with respect to how the depressed individual experienced the world before the onset of depression, and distinct with respect to how other people, how non-depressed individuals experience the world. So it is unhomelike in both of these senses. Now, as the interpersonal aspect is the one that I'm looking at, I'm interested to see whether this unhomelike aspect is communicated to other people. However, another observation that I have come at through analyzing this report is that the experience of depression, precisely because it's such a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world, is indescribable to and incomprehensible by non-depressed individuals. So there are the claims that by depressed individuals saying that they cannot articulate their experience to other people. They cannot find the words to explain their experience to other people. But also, there is also the feeling that other people cannot understand what it is like to be depressed, unless, many people note, unless they have been through depression themselves. So it's like saying that, again, depression is such a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world that the only way that people can understand what it is like to be depressed is to have been depressed. Otherwise, it's very difficult or even impossible, people say, to explain what it is like to be depressed. So in an attempt to make depression describable, to put it into words and to make it comprehensible by other people, what depressed individuals very commonly do is they use metaphorical language to explain, to describe, to articulate their experience. And these are just some of the metaphors that I will be looking at today: incarcerated, suffocating, living in a bubble, living in a world in between, experiencing the world as black, gray, being in a prison. So this is in a way to find some words which can be common, which can be understood by non-depressed individuals in an attempt to make the experience comprehensible. Building on this, the final point that I will be making is that there is a specific metaphor, the metaphor of being a spectator in the world, which can help us understand the experiences of depression. So let's first see the first observation. The framework through which I will be analyzing the experience of the unhomelike in experience of depression has come from Ernst Jentsch and Sigmund Freud, who have both introduced and developed the concept of the unheimlich, the unhomelike, the unfamiliar, the uncanny in experience. So what they, before delving into their work, what Jentsch and Freud have suggested is that the homelike and the unhomelike in experience, or the familiar and the unfamiliar, or the homelike and the uncanny, merge in experience. So when we experience something as unhomelike, we experience it as unhomelike just due to the fact that it used to be experienced as homelike. So let's see how the contrast emerges here. So according to Jentsch, what is familiar in experience, and we use familiar here also as in replacement for homelike, what is homelike in experience, appears not only as welcome, but also straightforwardly self-evident. The example Jentsch gives is the sunrise. So it's the sunrise every morning is clearly self-evident. We don't question it. We expect it as something self-evident and something that will come, and we're not surprised in any way by its presence. So it's one of the most homelike and familiar aspects of experiencing the world. Now, experiencing something as uncanny, Jentsch says, means that one is not quite at home or at ease in the situation concerned, that the thing is, or at least seems to be, foreign to him. So we see the concept of the word foreign there. It's analyzed to mean something unhomelike, something uncanny, something that is not familiar. So the example that Jentsch gives where these two notions emerge is a wax figure example. He says that a wax figure, a human-like wax figure, is something that can include both the notions of the homelike and the unhomelike, because it's something that seems or looks homelike in the sense that it seems like we're looking at a person, but at the same time, it's something unhomelike, something unfamiliar, person that doesn't move, but just looks like a person. So Jem says there is a sense of the uncanny, something unhomelike experienced when we encounter a wax figure. Because he sees this as the merging of the homelike and the unhomelike. Freud follows a similar observation. So he says the German word unheimlich for unhomelike is obviously the opposite of heimlich, meaning familiar, native, or belonging to the home. So we are tempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar. So in this sense, the unfamiliar emerges from the familiar. So he adds that the heimlich, the homelike, belongs to two sets of ideas which, without being contradictory, are yet very different. On the one hand, it means that which is familiar and congenial, and on the other, that which is concealed and kept out of sight, whereas unheimlich and homelike expresses something uneasy, eerie, and blood-curdling. However, having these two notions in mind, where they merge is, Freud says, because in what is homelike, precisely understood as something which exists in the four walls of one's house, also expresses what is concealed, kept from sight, and withheld from others. So Freud adds, the homelike also expresses something which is mystical, obscure, and inaccessible. In other words, something unhomelike. So in this sense, the homelike and the unhomelike emerge, or as he puts it, what is heimlich thus comes to be unheimlich. He further emphasizes that heimlich is a word, the meaning of which develops through an ambivalence until it finally coincides with the opposite, unheimlich. So he concludes that the uncanny is in reality nothing new or foreign, but something familiar and old. So just to focus on the second paragraph or the last line, especially the last sentence, this is what we see in experiences of depression too. People explaining or describing their experience as uncanny, unhomelike, unfamiliar. But through this perspective, it's interesting to see that precisely the experience of depression as uncanny is not anything new in experience or foreign, but something familiar and old. So this goes back to the first question that we set today, with the statement, depression is distinct from one's ordinary experience of being in the world. Distinct in respect to what, we asked, and my response would be distinct in respect to how one experienced the world before the onset of depression. So experiencing the world as uncanny in depression happens on something familiar and old, something in a world in which one has lived all their lives, in an environment in which one lived all their lives, in interpersonal relationships that they had all their lives, but suddenly or gradually also, these relationships, this environment, this familiar environment starts to appear as foreign. So this is the contrast that I would like to us to understand here that the unhomelikeness of experiences of depression is experienced on a familiar world. So depressed people come to experience the known world, the familiar world, as unhomelike. And we will see this in a few shortly through some first-person accounts. So let's first look at the unhomelike aspect that people experience and explain through their some autobiographies or first-person reports in general. We see Salim Brampton here in her autobiography expressing the following. Depression is a terrible sense of our own overwhelming reality, a reality that we know has nothing to do with the reality that we once knew, and from which we think we will never escape. It's like living in a parallel universe, but a universe so devoid of familiar signs or life that we are adrift, lost. The part of this quote that I want to focus on for now is Brampton saying a reality that we know has nothing to do with the reality that we once knew. So it's a contrast between the home-like reality of the past and the unhome-like reality of the present moment. Smith, in addition, he says, depression remakes the world. It begins and the familiar world is seen without the seen as if through isinglass, recognizable in its outlines, but dimly. It loses substance, sight and sound and scent alike are gone, unaccountably blunt. Your vision has gone within, you're enwrapped by inner experience, none of it pleasurable. You are resident now in some parallel universe. Particularly the last line, you're resident now in some parallel universe, does express this unhome-like aspect of depression. And it's interesting how Smith plays on the senses. There is no sight, sound, scent, in the sense that one loses access to this otherwise familiar world. So we see that it is the home-like world that is experienced as unhome-like. Another quote by Kazin, and we'll explain it in a little bit. He says, the worst thing about depression is that it's a foretaste of death. It's a trip to the country of nothingness. Reality loses its substance and becomes ghostly, transparent, unbelievable. So such accounts highlight how depression profoundly affects the depressed individual's world experience as they describe the world as a place which is devoid of any signs of familiarity and as characterized by an overwhelming sense of unreality or emptiness. And this is persistent in experience to such an extent that people describe their world experience as marked by a complete disconnection from the world. So within this light, again, going back to Freud, he described this unhomelikeness that the concept of the unhomelike in general that I argue we can apply to depression, that the concept of the unhomelike arises from something familiar which has been repressed, from something familiar which has been repressed. So depression, the experience of depression is an experience of a familiar world which has otherwise been repressed. And again, this concept of the unreality arises in other accounts too, such as this account within the depression questionnaire, the Durham Depression Questionnaire developed by Matthew Radcliffe back in 2011. This is just to demonstrate this concept of people understanding or recognizing the distinctiveness of their own world experience when compared to one's world experience in health, or the non-depressed individual's world experience. Interestingly, what seems to exacerbate, what seems to make worse these feelings of unhomelikeness in depression is the feeling that as individuals realize that what used to be home-like is now experienced as unhome-like, they find it challenging or impossible to imagine returning to how things used to be in the past. So they cannot see a way in which they can experience the world as home-like again. And we see this in various accounts. Depression feels like the most isolated place on earth. I thought I had no hope of ever making it back to the place I called life. It's very interesting and perhaps tragic also how Brampton here contrasts depression to life. It's as if depression is the opposite of life. Harp below, he says, I felt sort of overwhelmed by the situation, and I was kind of sad that I was living the way I was living, and I didn't quite know how to get myself out of it. This is the point I'm making. A sense of feeling trapped. He adds, I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how to get myself out of this situation. And what I understand here, what I want to put forward is this, again, this contrast between the previously experienced home-like world and the now experienced unhome-like world. But on top of that, as I think these quotations emphasize, is not just the realization that what used to be experienced as home-like, now it's experienced as home-like, but also that returning to a home-like experience of the world is really, I would dare say, impossible based on these quotations, and on not only these quotations, but for example, these ones by Shaw also. He says, I was terribly alone, lost in a harsh and faraway place, a horrible terrain reserved for me alone. There was nowhere to go, nothing to see, no panorama. Though this landscape surrounded me, vast and amorphous, I couldn't escape the awful confines of my leaden ball and downcast eye. Again, I couldn't escape. So again, on top of the realization that the world is experienced as unhomelike, the fact that it cannot be escaped based on these accounts is something that I think exacerbates and makes it worse, makes the experience worse. Now, the question that emerges is, okay, if we have established that depression is such an unhome-like experience of being in the world, can it ever be communicated? Can it ever be understood by other people? Well, I think we should let the quotations speak by themselves, because it is a very common aspect of depression experiences that the experience itself is described. Well, it is reported to be indescribable and incommunicable. So people saying that they cannot find the words to accurately describe such a foreign experience of the world. So, for example, William Styron, he says, depression is a disorder of mood so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description. The horror of depression is so overwhelming as to be quite beyond expression. So as he points out, I think translating such an unhome-like being in the world into a language that can be shared with other people is, if not impossible, very difficult. So as a result, he says, depression is beyond description, beyond expression. And an additional account which reflects, which echoes this struggle which accompanies one's attempt to describe an experience which is ultimately beyond description is Louis Wolpert's. Wolpert says, severe depression borders on being beyond description. It's not just a feeling much lower than usual, it's quite a different state. A state that bears only a tangential resemblance to normal emotion. It deserves some now and special word of its own, a word that would somehow encapsulate both the pain and the conviction that no remedy will ever come. So in this quote alone, we see quite a few concepts that we have already looked at today. I will start with the last one, the conviction that no remedy will ever come, a belief that things cannot and will not get better. Of course, we can analyze this or interpret this in all sorts of different ways. One could say this is a very pessimistic way of looking at the world. But I'm not here to make a judgment on what this could mean or the motivations behind these accounts, or to maybe judge these people, just looking at the subjective experience of depression. And if so many people say that no remedy will ever come, this is in itself very, very interesting to look at and analyze. Another thing, of course, is that depression is beyond description or borders on being beyond description. And another concept that we have looked at is the comparison between depression in the present moment and what Wolpert says, put here as normal emotion. So this contrast between depression in the present moment and normal emotion. And we can interpret this as, we can explain how the depressed person knows what normal emotion is, because at some point in the past they have experienced normal emotion. Finally, within this topic, I want to also briefly discuss Martha Manning's work in her depression memoir. And it's also interesting that Martha Manning was a psychotherapist herself. She says, I wish I could tell people my story, but I never have. Some struggles are so solitary that they have drowned in words. And she later adds that I struggle to articulate how awful and isolating this feels, but I can't find the words. So again and again, we see these concepts or this feeling emerging that depression really cannot be put into words, cannot be put into ordinary language, to be explained, to be described to others. And I want to show some other accounts too, just to focus on to give some more idea of what it means of something to be indescribable within the context of depression. So Julia Kristeva, in her own memoir, she says, melancholia is an abyss of sorrow and uncommunicable grief that at times, and often on a long-term basis, lays claims upon us to the extent of having us lose all interest in words, actions, and even life itself. For some reason, I find the description of depression, of melancholia here, as a non-communicable grief, very very impactful. An experience of the world as grieving that cannot be communicated to other people. And within these, we can understand perhaps some of the previous quotations here on the second to last line, Manning saying that this experience have drowned in words, someone feeling that they are feeling that they have drowned in words, and really they cannot find the words to explain what they are feeling. Further in her book, Kristeva elaborates on the non-communicability of depression experiences by attributing depression to feelings of unhomelikeness. And what's interesting with here is that she says, the depressed individual is a stranger in her mother tongue. And this personally invited me to think how I would feel when visiting a foreign country which I don't speak the language, and it's really impossible for other people to understand my language, or for me to understand their language. So within this sense, this is what I think Kristeva tries to explain here. But on top of being unable to articulate someone's experience of depression, what I think is particularly interesting in Kristeva's account is that she says, not just a stranger in some language, but a stranger in her mother tongue. Imagine feeling a stranger to something so familiar, so home-like as our mother language. And again, here emerges the contrast between the home-like and the unhome-like that I have touched on from the beginning. Someone being a stranger in their mother tongue, something that from birth really is something that is familiar to us and home-like. So imagine suddenly or gradually becoming a stranger in something so familiar and home-like. A similar observation is made by Fiona Shaw, who says that her experience of the world in depression was in some language at once known but long forgotten. So this touches again on the contrast between the home-like and the unhome-like, but also on the indescribability of depression experiences. And finally, on indescribability, and then we will move into incommunicability. Feeling unable to share one's pain and suffering is an aspect of the experience that magnifies one's pain and suffering. So it's not only that one experiences the world as indescribable, but the fact itself that the experience is indescribable, this inability to share one's pain and suffering, is itself magnifies and exacerbates one's pain and suffering. And here we start to see the interpersonal aspect of depression experiences. Being unable to share and communicate your pain has an effect in people's interpersonal relationships. So as David Forster Wallace puts it, the depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing and articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. So on top of depression being impossible to put into words, the difficulty of sharing and articulating this pain contributes to the horror, as Wallace puts it. And within this context, we can also observe the incommunicable aspect of depression experiences. Lewis Wolpert, he says, until one has experienced a debilitating severe depression, it is hard to understand the feelings of those who have it. Andrew Solomon, he says, depression, like love traits and cliches, it's difficult to speak about it without lapsing into the rhetoric of saccharine pop tunes. It's so vivid when it is experienced that the notion that others have known anything similar seems altogether impossible. And let's look at Styron's also and comment on these together. Styron says the pain of severe depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it. It remains nearly incomprehensible to those who have not experienced it in its extreme mode. It is particularly interesting, I think, that they emphasize not only that it cannot be comprehended by other people, cannot be communicated and comprehended by other people, but a kind of a prerequisite for understanding depression is having experienced it. Whereas there are perhaps some kinds of experiences that maybe first-person experience is not in absolute terms necessary to understand. But with depression, it seems that it is impossible to describe it and have it comprehended, understood by other people, if they have not experienced it themselves. Just focus on this first half of Karp's quote, also just to make this point. This is because Karp says the people that have really had it, they know what you're talking about. You don't have to try to explain it. You really can't understand it if you've never been to the point where it's more than you can do to get your ass out of bed and get in and take a shower. I mean, to take a shower is a major production. It's really something so foreign to ordinary experience that it's impossible for someone to understand it, Karp says, and so many others, if one has not experienced it. Again, someone in depression questionnaire makes exactly the same point. Unless people have experienced it themselves, they find it almost impossible to understand that depression is a totally different form of what we all understand as being fed up, a bit down, or having a bad day. The point of including so many quotations here is to show that this is not just some examples of many. This is the norm. This is what's common within experiences of depression. These concepts, these feelings come again and again within experiences of depression. So there is something deeper within the experience of depression in order for people to say that they feel that they cannot articulate their experience and have it understood by other people. And here we can bring the unhomelike aspect in. Depression is such an unhomelike state of being in the world that the only way for it to be experienced, for it to be understood, is for it to have been experienced by someone. And in order to also connect these ideas to the interpersonal aspect, let's look at another account from the depression questionnaire, in which this person identifies. They don't speak generally about their sense of disconnection, but they say generally they say specifically which aspects of the experience of depression are the most difficult to convey to other people. They say it's very difficult to explain to others who have never felt it, that the world looks distorted and imposing and alien, and that I don't have a place in it. It's like being in a bubble with no sound or color, and a complete lack of familiarity in everything, even in places I know well, like my home. Even people seem very alien. So as this person emphasizes, the feeling of disconnection arises where there is a lack of familiarity, even in places one knows well, such as one's home. So in this sense, inhabiting a different realm than other people acts as an obstruction both to one finding the words to describe their experience in ordinary language, and also to other people comprehending one's experience of depression. So as such, the connection between the feelings of indescribability and incomprehensibility or incommunicability is revealed as constituting these interpersonal disruptions in depression. When you cannot experience something, even something like one's home or one's people, close people to one's life as familiar, then it follows that there will be disruptions within this aspect. And I'll just present a few quotes which also identify another reason of why depression seems to be incommunicable and incomprehensible by other people, and that comes from the stigma that surrounds depression. I'm gonna read this, but just to highlight a few words. People saying that others think that one can snap out of it or cheer yourself up. Second account says again, people want you to snap out of it, pull your socks up, look for the positive. This is not what depressed people expect from others, and this is not what it seems that they can do to get out of this experience. The impossibility in getting out of depression connects with the feeling of incommunicability, because it seems impossible, as these reports say, for other people to understand that one cannot just snap out of it or look for the positive or just decide to not be depressed. As the second person says, it has nothing to do with laziness or willpower. It's something much more deep than this. Something that affects one's world as a whole. And going to the final kind of observation for today, this feeling that just because depression is indescribable and incommunicable to others and incomprehensible by them, depressed people seem to be making these attempts to explain or describe their experience using some metaphors. So Thompson, for example, she explains it in the way we saw before, as an exile into a foreign territory of the mind, as something unfamiliar, unhomelike, but at the same time, she says, this foreign territory is right next door. So it's something close. What is experienced as unhomelike or foreign is something which in reality is close to us. From a report by Keele and Staffordshire University, this person says, I existed in a world in between, as if existing in a world between the let's say, the world of the depressed individual and the world of non-depressed individuals. Lewis interestingly says you're off on some other planet half of the time. So again, it's something very unfamiliar, very foreign to experience. What Stern he seems to further highlight this foreign aspect, this unfamiliar aspect of experiences of depression that seem to have nothing that resembles one's home-like experience of the world. And within this regard, I'd like to look at the particular metaphorical language that depressed people use to explain their experience. So as some of the following accounts highlight, it seems that expressing this experience in metaphors is the only way that this can be done. If there are no words to explain depression, then metaphors seem to be the only way to talk about the experience, as Solomon puts it. And some of these metaphors are the following. Some of them have to do with prisons. Dorothy Rowe, she says, it's like a great big prison. Styron says something similar. It resembles the diabolical discomfort of being imprisoned in a fiercely overheated room. And again, he emphasizes this fact that there is no escape from it. So one aspect is being imprisoned. Another aspect is the unhomelikeness of experience. Another aspect is that it is inescapable, as we have already seen, but also suffocating. David Karp says, it's like I'm in a cage, I'm trapped and being suffocated. The suffocating aspect we can also understand through the previous accounts of that we have looked earlier, which said that I cannot escape depression. I cannot imagine how I can experience the world again in a home-like manner. This David Foster Wallace, he compares depression to being underwater, under a body of water that has no surface. And again, he emphasizes a bit implicitly this inescapability, that no matter where you go, you're not going to get out of it. You will keep facing restriction and suffocation. Other quotations focus on the aspects of living in a bubble or in a balloon. In an account by Doric and Martin, that person that they interviewed said, I'm stuck inside a big, thick bubble. I can street through the bubble, they say, but it's like everyone outside is distant. They cannot participate in the world, but they are restricted in observing the world through the bubble. Ridge says something almost identical. It's like you have a sort of bubble around you from which you cannot break, and nothing from outside gets through to this. Even if the queen says, he says, came here, I wouldn't snap out of it. It's like it's completely impossible for someone to do this. And also, one final metaphor before we move on and slowly close this talk is the metaphors that have to do with perception. Everything seems dark and gray. Everything looks dark, black, and bleak says the other person. So having all these metaphors in mind, they seem to do some work. I think we can really see how these metaphors can be used in some way to make non-depressed people understand the experience. What depressed people seem to be doing here is comparing the experience of depression to an experience that non-depressed people can have or have had, so that they try to communicate these aspects of depression. So, for example, in experiencing the world as gray, perhaps what I think they try to communicate is to the non-depressed person is like telling them, well, you've all seen or perhaps seen some film in black and white or something in television in black and white. Imagine if your whole life was like this. Imagine if your whole life was experienced in black and white. Or perhaps far fewer people have experienced suffocation or imprisonment, but at least in this respect, it's easier to communicate at least the imagination of suffocating or being in prison. It's like they ask the non-depressed person to imagine being imprisoned and incarcerated all their lives, or being in a vast ocean and not being able to find the coast, no matter where one goes, not being able to find the coast. So is this what I think the work that the metaphors do is they compare the experience of depression to an experience that non-depressed people can more easily relate to, which they can then apply to experiences of depression. And finally, what I am arguing all these metaphors have in common, what they have in common, is a spectatorial aspect. So the depressed person being a spectator in the world. And what do we mean by this aspect of spectatorial experience? It's various quotations. These are taken from Matthew Radcliffe's depression questionnaire, in which people say, well, there is a barrier between me and the outside world starting from the end. I can see what's happening around me, but I'm standing still. I feel disconnected from the world, like a spectator. I can see the world. I'm watching the world, but I have no way of participating. And this seems to me that expresses a spectatorial aspect of experience that we have seen before through other metaphors. The metaphor of being in a bubble. They express this. I'm in a bubble, but I cannot reach out to the world. And of course, we can bring again the home-like aspect in, the world within the bubble, or within the place behind the barrier that the depressed person is in, is unhome-like, and there is no access. There seems to be no access to the world. So we just finally two more things. One, I would like to show some two quotations which highlight the spectatorial aspect of depression experiences, and then I will show how I think these affect the interpersonal relationships of the depressed individual, and then connect everything to the concept of the unhomelike. We have Brampton again explaining the depression in terms of a play that she's witnessing. Ariana Matute, she also says something very similar. It's as if my whole life is a play, and I'm just sitting here with the crowd, just watching how my day goes by without being able to participate in it. That's what she says. I'm a spectator. I'm no longer the director of my play, no longer the director of my life. And I watch as everything is falling apart, being unable to do anything. And within the concept of interpersonal relationships, again, Brampton, in this very influential book, she expresses that this lack of connection, this lack of being able to describe one's experience and have it understood by other people, really alienates the individual and disconnects them from other people. Even with metaphorical language, there still seems to be something that's missing from the experience. And finally, Thompson, she speaks here about mental illness, but as you can see, her memoir is about depression, so she speaks about it within the context of depression in particular. So she says, it seems to me the basic definition of any mental illness, including, of course, depression, is this persistent, painful inability to simply be with someone else. It might be lifelong, or it might descend like a sudden catastrophe, this blankness between ourselves and the rest of the world. The blankness might not even be obvious to others, but on our side of that severe connection, it will show a life lived behind glass. So I want to finish with this quotation because it expresses, I think, quite a few of the concepts we have touched on today. First, the disruptions in interpersonal relationships, the inability to simply be with someone else. I think Thompson's use of the most perhaps basic and used verb in English language is to simply be, to simply exist with someone else, really shows how all-encompassing depression is, to the extent that it can be lifelong. And also with the last sentence, it's like Thompson makes this contrast, but on our side of that severe connection, like there is, like the depressed individual is on one side of something, spectating, looking at the world without being able to participate in the world, in a place that, as we have seen, is very much unhomelike. So really, thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you for the invitation. I would be very much willing to hear your thoughts, ideas, questions, comments, criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelos, for this very, how to say, fascinating journey through the bleak and amorphous landscape of the experience of depression that you took us on. And we open up discussion. So do we have any questions or comments from people online or here? Okay, we have a raised hand. Richard?
Okay, thank you, Angelos. That was an interesting talk. I've got one question I wonder if you can make a comment on.
Angelos, excuse me, if you can stop sharing your presentation, it would be better.
Sorry?
Thanks. Go
Right,
on.
yes. I was struck by the quote by the psychotherapist Christeva when she talks about being a stranger in her mother tongue. And I was also struck by a lot of the descriptions of depression. So the first thought I had was that that actually it seems that people can describe their depression very well. The fact they do it in metaphorical terms doesn't mean it's not a good description. They do seem to describe it well. So I'm thinking. So my question is really, what's going on here? And two possibilities occur to me. So first possibility is maybe they can just describe their depression later once they've come out of their depression, and so the descriptions are after the event, after they're no longer depressed. Or alternatively, I'm wondering whether they can describe it at the time, but what the problem they have is a lack of take-up from people they're trying to communicate to. And of course, you talk about it being the difficulty of communicating it. And I think that's why Christeva's quote interested me when she talks about being a stranger in her mother tongue. In language, when we talk, we expect other people to take up, understand what we're saying. So I'm wondering which it is. Is it that people can describe their depression, but it's not taken up by their interlocutors, or they can only describe it when they're no longer depressed, when they come out of the depression?
Thank you. That's some very good points, very good observations. So to say a few things. Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. Using metaphors is a way of describing things. So it would be, yes, inaccurate to say that depression is wholly indescribable, because otherwise, I think the only way to say something is indescribable is if someone is perhaps silent. So since they at least use some language, some words to explain their experience, to articulate their experience, this is a way of describing it. Where I think the difference is, and it occurs both when people are within depression. So some of the quotations I presented were with people describing their experience while they were depressed. Some others are after they have recovered. Is that some of the metaphors we use are more easily understood within the context of language. So I don't know, if you use, say, metaphors like the tip of the iceberg, the elephant in the room, perhaps someone who's not a speaker of the English language will not understand what we mean by these, or someone who has recently started to learn English. So the fact that we understand what we mean by the tip of the iceberg or the elephant in the room is that we share some socio-historical, cultural aspects of us living in the same phenomenological world that allow us to understand each other when we use metaphorical language in our everyday language, in ordinary language. And I think what demonstrates this is that, and something I didn't mention, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say it, is that there are many reports by depressed individuals that say that when they communicate with other depressed individuals, they describe how easy it is and how it's not challenging at all to be understood by each other. And this can be interpreted, I think, in a phenomenological sense, to say that two depressed individuals, they live in the same world, they experience the same world, so it's easy for them to understand the metaphors or the experience itself. So definitely, metaphors are, we use metaphors, of course, every single day in our language, are a valid way of describing things. So I think the incommunicability or the indescribability, if I may use that word, comes due to these fundamentally different experiences of the world.
So it sounds like the problem is the lack of shared experience that between the depressed person and the non-depressed person, which makes the communication very difficult. The lack of shared experience seems to be a key feature here. Am I right?
That's what it seems to be, yes. And the fact that so many people emphasize that it's not only the fact that depression is incomprehensible by other people, but the fact that they add this statement in some way or another that, well, the only way to know about the experience is to have it to have been through it yourself. And of course, this might not be limited to depression. Lauren Paul is this philosopher. She developed this concept of transformative experiences. She says that you cannot understand any experience unless you've been through it, because it makes you, quite literally, she says, a different person. So the examples she gives is being a mother or giving birth.
Yep.
This changes, she says, a person to such an extent that it makes them a different person. So understanding what it is to be a mother or to give birth is limited to those who have been through or are going through these experiences.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And we have another question from Wayne.
Hello, Angelos. I liked your talk. It was very good in my opinion, and especially the part about depression as something connected to what we remember has been different in the past. So that's the closeness to nostalgia is also and melancholy is also related to that, and we know that from the experience of many of us that when we start with a new period in our life, so if we stop being students and start working, for instance, or if we marry and so on, we remember the past generally as something that was good, unless something really bad happened in that period. So we don't even have to be depressed, but simply a bit sad when we become when we depart with our lives from a previous period in our life. So it's a fine line between nostalgia, sadness, depression, and so on. I'm talking now not about severe cases of clinical depression, but about milder cases between which this fine line exists between those milder cases of depression and just sadness and nostalgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. That's a very interesting point you raised. It really is. I think you're absolutely right. A matter of nostalgia, remembering how things used to be, but not being able to experience that thing again. So it can be compared to some experiences that are impossible in every sort of way to experience again. No one, well, I'm not sure if anyone here is described, let's say under 18 years old, but being a teenager, no one will of us will ever again experience being a teenager with whatever that comes, whatever implications this has in one's world experience and world view. So definitely experiencing nostalgia, nostalgia for some place that has been lost because of war, nostalgia in being a refugee as well. This just mentioning things that have been discussed and developed in the literature, and these relates to nostalgia, definitely, that people people feel in depression. What's interesting and if anyone here is familiar with this area of phenomenology, I would like to hear from you, is well, certain diseases, particularly bodily diseases, are someone will have them from birth. Let's say being blind since birth, or being deaf since birth. So one will never, they will not have experienced the before and after, before blindness and after blindness, before being deaf and after being deaf. So it would be interesting to see this, the phenomenological aspect of these kind of diseases, which one can have from birth, and some disorders like depression, which as far as some aware medically, one cannot be diagnosed with depression at birth. So it is a matter of developing depression, or being diagnosed with depression, or having depression at some point in one's life. So in depression, there is, the point I'm trying to make is that in depression, there is always the aspect of before and after in comparison to other kinds of diseases. So it seems to be the nostalgia aspect. It's core, it's fundamental to the experience.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Another question from Sergey. Go on.
Yes, thank you very much for your deep and thoughtful presentation. My question is about how do you see the relationship between the alienation among depressed people, the experience of alienation linked with depression, and political or economic alienation? And what about the relationship between unhomelikeness and social experience of migration? So how depression experience merge with social, political contexts? Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. I think it connects with the concept of the unhomelike. Perhaps those, well, I can speak from experience, having lived in a in a foreign country, but also everyone who has, I think, lived in a foreign country has experienced to some degree this unhome-like aspect of living in some place away from home. And definitely this is much more the feeling is much more strong and vivid when it comes to being forced to leave one's country, and experiencing and taking into consideration these political and economic alienation that you said. And from, although it's not my field, so correct me if I'm wrong, but from the research we have seen, it seems that people who being an immigrant or a refugee or living in a country with political instability are just some of the factors that correlate with depression in people. And within the context of this talk, they do seem to be connected with the topic of alienation from a home-like place, leaving a home-like place, a home-like and familiar experience of the world, and perhaps being unable to experience it again. So definitely these are contributive factors to one's experience of the world as depressed.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any more questions? We have a question from Irina. Irina, go on.
Hi.
Mm.
Hi, and yes, thank you for your presentation. And yeah, I would like to go back a bit to, I think, second question, or your response to the second question. And that is that I was, while not being in this field of research and listening to you, I wondered, it seemed to me like a compilation of experiences of depressed persons that we all more or less probably were in touch with, or we heard them. So on one level, I wonder, what is the, if you say they don't feel understood, or there is this lack of not having the experience, that the others don't have the experience, what is do we have any knowledge about that depressed persons would feel better if they would feel understood? Or is this just like, I will, if a man would understand what it means to give birth, I would not feel much better when I'm in the delivery room at that point. However, this is, of course, depression. It's something that is considered an illness, while giving birth is not. So it is also, this distinction is to be made when we talk. But generally, I was much in accordance with what you were saying, that there are many experiences in which people don't, somebody who suffers of cancer, or you have people who suffer their whole life or from one point of their life in chronic pain, and nobody can understand them. We can understand that there is something that is giving them a hard time. So I wonder, what is the distinction? Also, giving in a wider sense, we don't understand, if we are white, we don't understand what it means to be black in a world of white people. Or we don't understand, if we are not a woman, we don't understand what it. So it can go endlessly, and I wonder whether there is something specific for depression in why you took this subject. What makes it different from all these other experience of this kind? Thank you.
Very good question and very good observation that, of course, understanding someone who gives birth perhaps will not make a difference for them, but what we see in depression is that being understood by other people is can mean a lot, because in the depressed person's mind, or perhaps in everyone's mind, being understood means being able to connect with the other person. And being able to connect in turn means that we are filled with a sense of belonging in the world. So there is this sense that one brings the other. A sense of being understood means a sense of connection, which means a sense of belonging in the world. While you were asking a question, I was able to find this quotation I included in my thesis. Sorry, oops, no. That I think relates to your question. Just to give some context, I'm within discussing how the positive consequences of having one's experience acknowledged or understood by other people. So here is the author, Elizabeth Wurzel, who in her memoir, she says the following that her mother told her. Elizabeth, she says, "You are the most reasonable voice I've heard from. There is something wrong with you. You are depressed. That's a real problem. That's not imaginary. Of course, you can't deal with anything. You are depressed." And Wurzel further, she says, all the Turner faculty at Harvard Medical School, all the best doctors in the world could tell me you are depressed, and still it wouldn't have meant as much as my mother telling me that I have a problem, that she understands and it will be all right. So just the fact of telling the other person, I hear you, I understand you, I know where, I try to understand what you're feeling, and not saying all the things I presented at toward the end of the talk, to think positively, or get out of it, or snap out of it, or pull your socks up, or any of the sort. What depressed people seem to be looking for, based on this quote and a few others, is this sort of notion of being understood, of trying to be understood, or notion of I hear you, I understand, I try to understand that this is what you're feeling. And of course, it's further than these kinds of get out of my area, how it can be applied in a therapeutic or clinical setting. But thankfully, the field of phenomenological therapy or philosophical therapy is on the rise. So I'm currently looking for ways in which this mostly theoretical understanding of depression can be applied in a clinical setting. But at least within our everyday, day-to-day, ordinary experiences with other people, if we know people who are depressed, some close family member or some close friends, from these experiences that I have researched, it seems that what seems to ease the pain and the suffering of the depressed person is saying that, well, I can hear you, I can try to understand what you're feeling, not dismiss their experience, and try to assure them that they can be hopefully understood.
Irene Trumos.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. But yeah, maybe you will also come to my second question. But before that,
Sorry.
I mean, I think, yeah, also from some family experience, I think I'm taking it for granted that close people show understanding, and that when just further, I never had really the impression that, I mean, yeah, this is of course a complex issue in the sense of we never know what eventually was helpful for them to overcome it, if they overcome it. And this certainly is one step. But yeah, what I meant is whether you know of some research that shows a crucial impact of this, of being understood. Because, you know, we, as I said, I mean, probably you also, or with your reading about this topic, saying only that signaling to the person that it is understood is not sorting out the issue on its own. So this is what I also mean in comparison to other, with my second question, in comparison to other experiences that are unique and for which people usually seek to be understood in order to move on. Because this, as I see it, is probably simply a human need to be not only understood, but to be taken as it is. You know, take me even if I don't have an arm, or take me if I'm blind, or you know, whatever happens, that people feel at ease if they are in a way accepted the way they are. And so with children you have the same. I mean, with children it is even more visible how they suffer if they are not understood. Or, I mean, it is also a matter of being accepted, being part of the community, and so on. Yeah, only with this, you know, that I wondered how much this impacts. Is it just to, okay, I'm depressed and I understood and this is fine for me, even if I am depressed until the end of my life? Or it makes a difference of, yeah, I'm depressed, and if I would be understood, I would get out of it much quicker.
Thank you. Yes, it's from the research we have seen that it's the latter. So a connection with someone helps someone get out of depression. It's like these things are so intimately connected, that establishing connections with other people, at least through a phenomenological point of view, is the way to gradually start getting out of depression. Because again, from a phenomenological point of view, depression is understood not as a chemical imbalance in the brain or something merely genetic or just as a medical condition, but as a condition of disruptions in experiences of the world, which connects to disruptions in interpersonal relationships, kinds of disruptions that we mentioned earlier with Sergei's question about being forced out of one's house, being forced to change one's environment, being an immigrant somewhere. So since losing connection with other people, or having one's interpersonal relationships being disrupted, seems to be constituting depression, then the opposite follows also, that re-establishing connections with other people, belonging in an environment in which one's experience can be understood, at the same time seems to bring people out of depression. And I would definitely be willing to share some research with you, some studies, phenomenological studies that have been made on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Do we have any more questions or comments? If not, I will do one. So I find this very interesting, and this whole idea of understanding depression through the feeling of unhomelikeness, a very original and interesting proposal. So do you think that this particular experience is what makes depression a distinct disorder, what expresses in the best way what depression is? Or could something similar or the same be found in other disorders, for example, like schizophrenia or something like that? Because this is an experience of disconnectedness or disruption from the experience of the world. So you are describing the depression as disordered experience of the world, or being in the world, as you put it, this phenomenological notion of being in the world. So it's not just the social relations, the interpersonal aspect being in some way different, but the whole experience of the world, whatever that means, toward different objects or the material world around the person. So would you say that this is the best way to describe the distinctness of depression, or could you make some kind of a connection with other disorders where this feeling might come up in the same way or not? Just a clarificatory question.
Definitely, thank you very much. So to address the first part of your question, yes, I would say that this is the aspect of unhomelikeness is a fundamental aspect of depression experiences. But going to the second part of your question, it's not, I would say it's not specific to depression. So it is the case that unhomelikeness, although when we only look at depression, it seems to constitute the disruptions in experience that take place in depression, it's by no means exclusive to depression. Other, as you mentioned, schizophrenia, we can also identify the aspect of unhomelikeness, and more commonly and more vividly in grief and early stages of dementia. In grief, we see a very strong distinction between this before and after. One day the person is there, next day the person is not there. It's almost a sudden, sometimes a very sudden change from homelikeness to unhomelikeness. Early stages of dementia, and I say early stages because it's unfortunately only at the early stages that people can have some memories, some memories of what life used to be before, at least some foggy memories of how life used to be before the onset of dementia. So it's definitely the homelikeness aspect, something that we see in other disorders or other conditions also. And if I may add, it's not even the concept of homelikeness with respect to depression is not even exclusive to interpersonal relationships. So in my thesis, for example, of course I don't introduce myself the concept of unhomelikeness in depression. This has been researched by other people before, and most commonly by Frederick Sveneus, who examined the concept of the unhomelike with respect to bodily somatic disruptions in depression. And I just take this concept and I apply it to interpersonal relationships. So it's very interesting to see that even within the same condition, there is a way in which unhomelikeness applies to interpersonal relationships in depression, a way in which unhomelikeness applies to bodily disruptions in depression, and further than that, of course, it applies to other conditions or disorders or illnesses as well. And it's actually a very interesting proposal to research and investigate something like that, how the concept of the unhomelikeness arises in different conditions and the differences and similarities between them.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very useful phenomenological concept to have when trying to understand any kind of mental illness or disorder, when it has this kind of a temporal aspect, in the sense that there is something before something happens, and this kind of disorder or illness evolves or develops in a certain way, but there is a sudden or not so sudden change of the way that we view or experience the world. So, but then again, you would need to just add more nuance to the concept in the example of every aspect of a different disorder. It's somehow different in depression and again different in schizophrenia and so on, but still a very good and useful phenomenological concept. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, totally agree with you. And it's really worth investigating it.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Do we have any? Okay, yes. Do we have any more questions? If not, then I will just thank again Angelos for his fascinating presentation, very interesting presentation today on depression, and this new notion, this new concept from phenomenology that he introduced to us today. Hopefully he will be again our guest on our seminar. And thanks to everyone who was here online today and asked questions. Thank you for a great discussion. Hopefully I will see you again in a couple of weeks on the next seminar of philosophy and psychiatry.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.